And we are live.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It really is an absolute thrill to be introducing to you a very long-standing friend and colleague, Professor Sofia Gruskin, for the latest in the Lancet seminar series for the Commission on Gender and Global Health. I'm sure most of you will know Sofia's name and her work from her preeminent position as somebody who really does take an incredibly multidisciplinary look at global health from the community through to the policy sphere, with a focus on the role that human rights can play in improving everyone's health outcomes. So with no further ado, I am going to hand over to Sofia, who is based in what looks like beautifully sunny Southern California. But for those of you who are joining us on YouTube, please do put your questions into the chat under the screen, and we will be able to pose those questions to Sofia at the end of her talk. Sofia, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for that lovely introduction. And let me say also good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm grateful for the invitation, but I'm also grateful to be on this commission with such amazing commissioners. And I'm grateful to you all for being here. So clearly we are all concerned with gender and global health from our various perspectives, or we wouldn't be here. And that's what brings us together. And I have to say, I've really enjoyed hearing and learning from the perspectives of the other commissioners on this topic. And I guess that I'm sort of here as the health and human rights person in this group. And so I wanted to explore what health and human rights can potentially bring to the discussion and to our work, but I have to admit, I do that with a certain amount of trepidation. With a bunch of exceptions, of course. There have always been some tensions between the gender and the human rights communities, which has roots that we may actually want to discuss and explore. But for purposes of this intervention, I want to be clear that I consider gender and human rights approaches to be synergistic and mutually reinforcing as frameworks for global health, and even more so if we can examine their strengths and weaknesses honestly. So I'm here trying to get less of what we all know human rights offers kind of in the usual way, but what it can potentially offer to the work on gender and global health. And that means trying to be honest about some of the strengths and weaknesses, particularly in the normative area, in the hope that that can help us move forward somewhat in terms of figuring out what can be relevant to the work of the Commission. So to set the context for thinking about what role human rights can play, I want to say something about the current moment, something that I realize we've all done on our own way in terms of our introductions to our work and our ways of thinking. And obviously we have to start with COVID. And I think it's fair to say that COVID has opened the way for us collectively as a society to realize that neither human rights nor health can be taken for granted by anyone, anywhere in the world. And that is in the context of the stark inequalities that have always been here and that predate COVID. And in many ways, I feel that we're at a crossroads, not only in terms of how COVID is ravaging kind of all of our societies in the medical sense, but in terms of what it's showing us about the fault lines within our societies and across our societies. And most importantly, the commitment, or let me say the lack of commitment, to doing something about it in a real way. And I'm talking at a political level, of course, but also within our communities, the extent to which we care about what's happening, not only in our own societies, but across the world. The sense of global solidarity, which disturbingly doesn't seem to be as present as I think any of us had assumed it would be. And what we're now all committed to actually doing about that. And within that, we have to consider how COVID has and continues to negatively impact much, if not all, of the economic, social, political indicators that we know of. And from the current moment, in terms of from a rights perspective, we have to see this along what I'm going to call the whole broader parade of horribles. The fact that funders are dismantling their health and rights agendas to some extent because COVID has diverted resources, but not only. But the ways that the power of law and the police power of public health in particular have been used and misused in the name of COVID without valid public health justification or evidence, or justified in the name of public health, but actually detrimental to health in ways that I think are going to have implications for decades to come. And when you put that alongside rising nationalism, rising populism, increased conservatism, shrinking society, civil society space, clearly it's truly worrisome. And looking ahead, I do fear that things are only going to get worse before they can get better. And so I think we need to radicalize our thinking and our approaches in many areas relevant to global health. And I do see that operationalizing the links between human rights and gender in a real way may be one of the most opportune things we can do for the field of global health right now. So allow me to say a few things about what I mean by human rights, because I think often people mean different things, and this leads to unnecessary confusion. And if we're going to figure out how to be mutually reinforcing in terms of the use of these paradigms, then I think we need to be able to understand each other in the terms that we use. So when I'm talking about human rights here, I really do mean the relationship between the individual and the state in terms of what governments can do to us, cannot do to us, and should do for us, and their legal obligations to us. And while I feel very much this focus on the state is absolutely key, let me begin to air my dirty laundry. One concern that I have, and that many of us have, is whether in the current moment that framework is too narrow to reach the just societies that we're all striving for. What are or should be the obligations of multinational corporations like Pfizer or Moderna in the current moment? What are or should be our obligations to the planet and to the future generations in the wake of this and future pandemics, let alone changing climates? These issues are not sufficiently addressed in rights frameworks, and this is a preoccupation, even as I think that the focus on law, on process, and on legal accountability of governments for what they do and don't do is a key strength that doesn't exist in the same way in other frameworks. And I think it's one of the keys of what human rights can alter to our work in global health. Now, in terms of defining my terms, I also wanted to say something here about how global health is defined, is I think each of these definitions is relevant to the sorts of things this commission is interested in doing together. But just to point out a few things, most importantly are the colonialist tendencies of global health, something Pascal beautifully articulated in her talk several weeks ago, but something I'm acutely aware of needing to address at all times, particularly sitting in a US-based research university. And that means, and I see this in the context of the commission too, needing to acknowledge our place of privilege, all of us, that brings us into this conversation today on Zoom. And yet, trying to figure out how do we usefully both account for the knowledge and experience that allows us to be here and to contribute usefully, but also recognize and take on that place of privilege at the same time. If our focus is on achieving equity, not just for people in a doing for others kind of way, but amongst all people everywhere in the world, the work of listening, but also of talking and dialogue and hard conversations is going to need to be done by everyone if this is going to work. Ourselves, also the next generation, but also, believe it or not, generations older than us. We have to all be in this together and ready to really actually work, talk, and listen to each other, and not just cancel each other out if we don't like what we hear, if this is going to work. And I note here in that respect really the value of articulating health as a right, because it kicks in then the legal obligations of governments in ways that are important and useful. And so maybe just to state the obvious here, sorry, I just need to go back one. Just to state the obvious that all of these rights are relevant to health and well-being, not just the right to health. And I think there's a lot of value in focusing on the potential of legal obligations and accountability in relation to each of these rights for the governments of the world and how this can be useful to our collective efforts in global health. When we think about gender, non-discrimination is clearly key and something I'm going to want to talk about in a bit in more detail. But do you see and agree with how all the rights listed here, particularly when conceptualized as legal obligations for which there is accountability, are relevant to global health and to the kind of work that we might want to do together? But efforts are definitely needed to strengthen the accountability mechanisms, but there's something here to work from. And that points to the fact that how differently rights language, terminology, concepts, and methods are used in global health, and how we need to see and connect on the value of these differences. You know, there's this naming human rights or a human rights agenda is important for signaling a broad concern with justice. That's useful, it's important. And it can be used to achieve local, national, global solidarity, and that's great. But on its own, it doesn't result in accountability or challenge governments or institutions of power. But it's useful language to get folks to know the frame that you're using and that you're concerned with justice. And I compare that to a violations approach. When you see something bad is happening and you call it out as a rights issue, again, that's quite useful. And it doesn't have to be grounded in what the law is. It's often language that's used by the media or by my students when they see something bad and rightly want to call it out. But it's more focused on their perception of a rights violation happening rather than necessarily rising to the level of a violation as the human rights community would understand it to be. And that said, this violations approach is often used by human rights organizations after systematic investigation to call out violations. For example, the failure to deliver reproductive or sexual health services to certain populations. But when they do this, it's about calling it out after it's occurred, but based on rigorous investigation using right standards and methodologies to do so. And I distinguish that from the more operational, that's not only about preventing violations from occurring in the first place, but about integrating human rights concepts and methods into the processes of how health and related services are delivered. For example, including the principles of non-discrimination or participation in how reproductive and sexual health services are designed or implemented and evaluated. So basically using rights concepts to achieve better health outcomes. And I think the interactions of gender with all of these is fairly clear and can be useful to our work. But I think it's the legal where there's room for definition and something additional that might particularly be useful to our work together. So I'd like to spend a bit of time here. And when I say the legal, it's about the international frameworks, their strengths and limitations, because I'm hoping there's a real contribution to be made. But again, only if we're honest about what is and isn't actually there. So let me start by saying that for good or bad, whether one likes or believes in the UN, the definitions that are promulgated in their very different corners of the UN actually really matter. They matter at a conceptual and theoretical level, but also for funding, for policies, for programs, and ultimately also for people's lived experiences in all parts of the world. And what I'm referring to in the first instance is what governments and political leaders agree to with one another, whether or not it's consistent with what they say or do within their own countries, which is again, something we might want to discuss. But attention to these UN spaces is not only about what governments do in political spaces, it also brings to light the perspectives and priorities of health and development organizations, of human rights bodies, and of advocates. And in this way, we can also see how this reflects general political currents and social movements within countries as well as at the global level. So my point is that all of this impacts the legal, the political, and even the technical standards, excuse me, sorry about that, that we who are all concerned with advancing gender and human rights for global health are forced to contend with. And it's good to know what's there for good or for bad. And I'm going to suggest that there are three overlapping streams that can be seen to shape much of the current global landscape around health and rights, and potentially around gender as well. And again, loosely defining these as the technical, legal, and political. The technical stream, as I'm using it here, covers evidence-derived concepts, norms, standards, guidelines developed by research organizations, academic institutions, and particularly for these purposes, adopted by international technical agencies such as WHO and UNFPA. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'm not going to spend too much time here, but happy to come back to it. Within the legal stream fall the formal parts of the human rights system, including the comments, the guidelines, the recommendations that come out of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN treaty monitoring bodies, and other formal mechanisms, such as special rapporteurs, as well as international and regional court decisions. And then the political stream includes international and regional government processes, with particular emphasis on the agreements made by states with one another as these play out at the global level. And here, for example, I'm talking about the Human Rights Council as a political body, and for example, what comes out of the General Assembly, like the Sustainable Development Goals. And in all cases, I want to suggest it's good to know what they have to say about rights, rights, about health, and also about gender in a systematic way, not just in a piecemeal way. So we know what we have to contend with and to address. And we've done some work to show how these streams have a significant influence on one another in the context of HIV and in sexual rights. And we found that they are sufficiently distinct in orientation and priority that by naming them in this way, it's been useful for our work. And I hope to use these distinctions in support of our framing some strategic approaches to gender and rights in global health, in the hopes that this can help to influence not only how we think best to deal with them in the current moment, but the truth is we've only just begun to do this in the context of gender. So I feel like this is going to be a bit clunky and maybe not as fully correct as I'd like it to be, but I do still want us to be able to discuss it. So let me start with the legal and allow me to get into the weeds a little bit here. These are the UN level treaties we're all familiar with, I know that. And so what we did is working with a fantastic student, Samantha Norris, to do a deep dive to understand how, if we're going to focus on the legal potential of rights for our global health work, how the treaties and relevant documents address or think about gender. And to do this, we also had to engage with how they think about sex. And for good or for bad, we had to do this in terms of the English language, noting here that most of the official texts have English as their first language. And again, that's something we might want to come back to in the discussion. So not surprisingly, particularly given their age, the language of the treaties themselves, the word gender is used far less than the word sex. That's predictable. But what I think isn't so predictable, at least from my perspective, is that gender first appears in the treaty language in 2006. And for the Convention on the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearances, gender is the first time it's used, but it isn't referring to gender in the context of rights holders. It's only about some level of balanced gender representation amongst committee members. And here, like in the Convention Against Tortures and in others, there's an attempt to use quote unquote gender neutral language like the person in the treaty in terms of the rights holders. And again, we can discuss that, but I think that that's sort of interesting. And then to dive a bit deeper into the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is the first convention to address gender explicitly in its treaty language. And you're going to note that it talks about a gender perspective and uses other gender sensitive terms, but doesn't really define what they mean. And sure, we can say, let's go with the commonly accepted definition. But given the history of how the word gender has been batted about in the halls of the UN, I'm not sure what the implications are for legal accountability across countries and cultures. For example, in terms of the preambular language, is this to be interpreted to be only about a gender perspective in relationship to biological women, about a gender perspective in relationship to both women and men, for all people, that one should pay particular attention to folks who are transgender and are non-binary, or not at all? We need to know this as opposed to just assuming. And I point this out alongside the fact that in the one place that they actually talk about protection from discrimination, the second line there, they don't include gender. They only include sex. Even as there are historical reasons for including sex, they could absolutely have included gender, sex characteristics, as well as, for that matter, sexual orientation and gender identity as well. But here they rely only on sex as it's been used by the other treaty bodies, which is more narrow than I would have hoped. And I raise it because this sort of ambiguity is important to point out if the legal aspects of what human rights can offer is something we want to work with in some way. And this from the Disability Convention, which is the most recent and in some ways the most progressive, and so far has 82 signatory countries. Now, in terms of defining gender, suppose it's not surprising that the first gender definition of gender from the treaty bodies comes from CEDAW, in this general recommendation that helps us to update and clarify their language. And it was done in 2004, so 2 years prior to the Disability Convention. And here they rely on a technical definition, the 1999 World Survey on the Role of Women in Development, which I think is in itself kind of weird. But I raise it here because the implications are clearly, at least for CEDAW at this point, that it's about the relationship between biological women and men. But this was the first time a human rights body had provided a definition of gender, and for good or for bad, to this day, it's still relied on. Now, to note, there are two more recent general recommendations that they put out, one in terms of discrimination and one on older women, that refer explicitly to sexual orientation and gender identity. And basically both affirm that discrimination of women based on gender as well as sex is inextricably linked with other factors, including sexual orientation and gender identity. But this isn't part of the definition of gender that's relied on more generally per se. And I know that the CDOC committee and its reporting guidelines for states is also not consistent. And again, this is not saying anything wrong about CDOC. This is just an example across all the treaty bodies. Look at this appearance of sex and gender together. But notice also this idea of disaggregation of data that appears in terms of gender without sex, and then the appearance of sex without gender in terms of disaggregation as well. And I'm not trying to make a mountain out of a molehill, but I think it's important that we're dealing with how legal standards are understood by the governments we work with. And so we have to see these inconsistencies and talk about what they mean for what data are collected and what issues are prioritized. And this is key, for example, to note in terms of how different this is than, for example, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which basically subsumes gender into sex, if you can look at that definition. And I contrast that to the Disability Committee, which in 2016 trying to distinguish sex from gender. And please note, both these definitions are still current in terms of what governments understand to be how they understand their legal commitments to gender, with, I think, important implications for health, especially if a country is bound under both of these treaties, for example. So bottom line from my perspective is there's little consistency when it comes to using sex, gender, or both in what the legal standards offer. And why I'm bothering with this is because I think this inconsistency is something we have to contend with, even as I think there's real value to what human rights can offer to addressing gender and global health. So in terms of the political consensus documents, which in many ways, as we all know, are the lowest common denominator, since governments have to negotiate with one another about these texts. So, and I decided that in terms of which one of these I wanted to take the deep dive into, it's the Sustainable Development Goals, because I think for all of us, whether we're rights concerned or not, it seems to be the one that we all have to deal with in one way or another. So in terms of thinking about the SDGs, just think about this and this idea of leaving no one behind. And the fact, I mean, I think we all know this, the gender equality goal is pretty much explicitly about women and girls. But also see how the SDGs recognize sexual and reproductive health and rights in this rather awkward formula, whether as a result of fear or politics. Just look at the mismatch between the terms sexual and reproductive and the fact that only the term reproductive rights makes it into this goal. And for those of us that are concerned with the links between health and rights, this is the only place in the SDGs where our common concerns link. And I have to say, I think it's pretty paltry. And then here, you might want to note the weirdness of the reporting requirements. Look at this idea of the fact that on the one hand, you need data disaggregated by all the other terms stay the same. In one context, gender, in one context, sex, but everything else stays the same. Okay. And the issue is this has major implications for the sorts of data that are collected by countries in relationship to these goals, what funding is available, what programs, and for people even at the most local level, what they are given and are able to work with in terms of gender and health. And so even as though there's some promise in the gender goal in the SDGs, at least as far as it signals attention to interventions that are going to improve equality between women and men, it's fairly clear that gender intended in the SDGs is pretty much a static male-female binary. Issues, topics, and rights that address the diversity of sexualities, the intersection of sexual and gender diversity, let alone sexual rights at its most basic, are not a visible part of the SDG agenda. And I strongly hope this is something as a commission that we can take on and address. So if the SDGs are to be our blueprint for the future, and we do want to ensure no one's left behind, we have to see these limitations clearly and think strategically about how the SDGs can nonetheless be used to address gender and global health for all people, and even in this current political moment. So in short, within and beyond the SDGs, and beyond this quick tour of the legal and political with a concern with rights and gender, I don't have any doubt that we all agree that we need to ensure important issues like adolescent sexuality and the health needs and rights of people who are on the margins, whether because their behaviors are criminalized, because they're engaged in sex work, or they are engaged in drug use, or they're illegally within a country, or because they're living with HIV, or refugees, or internally displaced, or they live with disabilities, or they're from religious or ethnic minorities, or they're intersex, or the lesbian, gay, or transgender, or some combination of any or all of these, that their needs and rights don't slide off the table in how we address gender and global health, simply because it's a complicated political moment. But the issue is, how do we do it? which is why I wanted to bring rights and rights discourse into the conversation, despite its weaknesses, because I think maybe for the reasons listed here, it can be helpful in the current moment. And I have to say, I remain a huge believer in engaging multilateral institutions, that these issues are not going to be adequately addressed globally simply if we work within our own silos. And I think we have to consciously engage the system as a whole. And the sorts of questions listed here, I think, are key to moving us forward. And I'm happy to, again, to discuss these in our conversation. So what about action? Let me lay out quite concretely what I think human rights and a conscious effort to engage human rights can do, and within a framework of legal accountability, what rights can offer to work in gender and global health. Because contrary to how many organizations think these days, this gets us looking at health outcomes, but not only health outcomes, but also systematically at how health services are provided, including who's benefiting and, importantly, who's being left out, what's being done by governments to achieve that outcome, and if this is good or bad in gender rights and health terms over and above the specific outcome, all while ensuring attention to the legal environment and accountability for what is and isn't done. And finally, I go back to where I started. I think there's a lot that we can share and learn from one another, and that this is going to take trust and honest conversation that would be so much easier to do if we weren't on Zoom. But there are important questions I would love to discuss at the theoretical level, and then to consider efforts that we might take together at the empirical level. And I'd love if out of the work of this commission, we could show how explicit attention to human rights and gender in public health programs really improves population health. And I just have to say, I'm as cynical as anyone, but I do believe human rights still has much to offer, particularly if we take inspiration less from the mainstream of human rights than from its edges, and particularly if we listen to the arguments, the strategic knowledge and priorities of the communities whose health and rights are most impacted in the current moment. You know, there's never been so much of an appetite to question modes and methods of accountability for health as there is right now, and I think that's great. And so with attention to the interplay between the technical, the legal, and the political, alongside the global, the regional, the national, and the very local, of course, I'm looking forward to working with you all, and amongst other things, considering how gender can help us figure it out, how the rights and health nexus needs to evolve for the future. And that seems a really good and exciting thing. So I'll stop there and really look forward to the conversation. So thank you.
Sophia, thank you so much for such a whirlwind tour, both of the current status of kind of where we're at, but also the looking at the historical origins of how we got to where we're at. And I'm going to kickstart the questioning with a couple of reflections. I mean, we've done a very similar review of the use of the term gender just within the global health discourse, and discovered that, I mean, completely unsurprisingly, given what you've just presented, that actually gender as a term didn't appear in multilateral global health documents until the early 1990s, and actually was kind of brought into the global health discourse from the world of agriculture, from the people who had come from women's rights to land use, for example, and were now, you know, deeply embedded in the world of development, and were now participating in global health discussions, and brought the terminology of gender from the world of agriculture. So it was fascinating to see that actually it took another 10 years before it reached the treaty documents in the same way. But actually what your talk reminded me of, and it's kind of how you started off, but also where you ended, that intersection between gender and human rights, and how problematic that intersection can be, both within the multilateral organizations themselves, but also at the level of member states. And I wonder if you could reflect or comment on whether you see the same discomfort around the use of human rights mechanisms to achieve health equity in the same places that you see discomfort around the terminology of gender? You know, what's the intersection of the challenge rather than the intersection of how we move forward?
I totally appreciate the question. Before I respond to the question, I also want to say, back to my interest in the work of this commission, I would love to bring together the work you're talking that you all have been doing about gender and global health with the work we've done around gender and rights, and pull those together in some way, because I think that could really give a broad picture that might be really useful to folks. So that's my first kind of reflection on what you said. And in terms of I think you hit it spot on. I mean, I think that the discomfort exists, and as I said, I think that there's also been tensions between the adoption or the reason for using different frameworks by member states. I'm not talking within our own communities, I'm talking with member states, and that in many ways, at times, these frameworks have been put in opposition to one another to champion different things, as opposed to recognizing their synergies and their strengths. And why I wanted to move beyond the discomfort into where do we go is to say, okay, let's acknowledge this and look at this, but then how do we take it to the next step? And let's be honest about what's there. And I do have to say that one of the things that is really so complicated is the extent to which the ways in which not only member states and not only the UN system, but our own communities also use these terms in opposition at times. And so what I'm hoping is that we can pull on the strengths of each to bring them together to kind of move forward. I'll stop there on that.
I think that is the challenge, for the challenge for the Commission, Sofia. So for now, given that we're at time, I'd like to draw a close to this part of the seminar, and thank you again for sharing a really provocative set of challenges that we're all facing, but hope that everybody who's watching this online will check back in to see how we try and square those two circles within the coming work of the Commission. So